want to talk about making things and fixing things. And that's because I think that kind of manual competence has a wider cultural significance. Consider that in the last, 10 or 20 years, there have been changes in material culture that make it harder to be self-reliant. Just harder, literally, to get a handle on your own stuff. There's a kind of design philosophy that's emerged where the point seems to be to hide the works. So, for example, if you lift the hood on some cars now, what you're likely to see is something like this. Essentially, there's another hood under the hood, as though the sight of an alternator would offend us somehow. Some high-end cars now don't even have a dipstick, so you couldn't check your own oil level if you wanted to. Instead, you're sent an email from someplace when your oil level gets low. And I can't be the only person who's a little bit creeped out by that. Some high-end cars now don't even have a dipstick. Not only that, consider that back in the day, there was something called an idiot light. And it was called an idiot light for a reason, right? We had a harsh judgment of anyone who was so uninvolved with their own car that they let it get to the point that the light is coming on. But there's some weird cultural logic whereby idiocy, that is a lack of involvement, gets recast as something desirable, right? It's a sign of technological progress. And of course, it is a kind of progress when you no longer have to mess around with dipsticks and dirty rags. But I also want to just notice that there is a kind of moral education that is tacit in material culture, and it can go in various directions. I think the way things are going currently, it often feels like the modern personality is getting reformed in the direction of passivity and dependence. There are fewer occasions to be directly responsible for your own physical environment. And with that, I think, comes less expectation of responsibility. If you're over a certain age, and I think a few of you are, you might remember that before the internet, there was something called the Sears catalog. It had much the same function. And it included blown-up parts diagrams like this for all the appliances that they sold. And it was just taken for granted that this information would be demanded by the consumer, who expected to own this for decades. By the way, raise your hand if you know what this is. Okay, just checking. It's a sewing machine. Whereas now, let's say your washing machine goes on the fritz. Well, even if you are the kind of person who's comfortable with motors and solenoids and relays, you might well feel daunted from taking on the repair yourself, just because of the layers of electronic bullshit that get piled on top of machines these days. And besides, time is money, right? You can't learn to do everything. You have to pick your battles. So from the perspective of a narrow economic calculus, it might make more sense to just get a new washing machine and haul the old one off to a landfill. Now, you can criticize that decision from the perspective of sustainability and environmentalism. And I think that that's an important argument to make. But the argument I want to make is different. It's really about the effects on the individual, because I think that this kind of learned helplessness leaves us bereft of something that's really at the core of being human. And that is individual agency. By that, I mean the experience of seeing a direct effect of your actions in the world and knowing that these actions are genuinely your own. And I want to highlight this idea because I think it's one of the signature features of modern life altogether, that we often feel like we're moving in these channels that have been projected from afar by sort of vast impersonal forces that we don't understand. Some of us worry that we're actually becoming stupider and begin to wonder if getting a handle on the world intellectually might actually depend on getting a grip on it in some literal and active sense. I think that's why tinkering is important. That's why shop class in schools is important. These are ways that a young person begins to make their world intelligible. And on the other hand, I think that if you don't feel that you can have an effect on the world, you're not likely to feel responsible for it. And at that point, maybe it makes sense to retreat into a virtual world where you're offered a kind of fantasy of agency and competence, right? In playing video games, you blow stuff up and you get blown up, and you just hit reset. So there are no real consequences to your actions. Unlike, say, wiring a house, where if you get it wrong enough, the house will burn down. So dealing with material stuff can be, I think, a kind of antidote to narcissism and the sort of self-enclosed fantasy worlds that modern culture relentlessly offers to us. Consider how work appears on TV. And that's sort of an easy way into the zeitgeist. There's a whole slew of shows about work that become very popular. So there's Ice Road Truckers, Deadliest Catch, which depicts these commercial fishermen in the Bering Sea. It's very rough work. There's another show called Dirty Jobs. There was one episode that featured a guy who inseminates turkeys for a living. And I think the weird fascination of these shows must lie partly in the fact that they're depicting these confrontations with material reality that have become exotically unfamiliar to us. Many of us do work that feels more surreal than real. And working in an office, it's often difficult to see any tangible results from your actions. What exactly have you accomplished at the end of any given day? And the chain of cause and effect can become opaque and confusing, so that experience of individual agency becomes elusive. And speaking of Dwight, there's some great sociological literature on middle managers. And the picture that emerges is that they tend to feel quite insecure in their jobs. If you're a carpenter, let's say, and you have a problem with your boss, you can say to him, it's plumb, it's level, and it's square. Go check it yourself. But when you don't have appeal to concrete standards like that, you're never quite sure where you stand. Everything's open to interpretation. And so as it turns out, what you have to spend quite a bit of your time doing as a manager is managing what others think of you. There's a lot of walking on eggshells. I think the office can be a fairly paranoid place as compared to the job site. And I think that's one reason this show succeeds so well is that it does a nice job of capturing that. And you could point to any number of other sort of pop culture items that I think are getting at something similar, namely that I think a lot of people have come to view their white-collar work with a kind of dark absurdism. And at the same time, though, we've developed a kind of educational monoculture where just about every kid gets pressured to go to college and get on a certain track where you end up doing the more ghostly kinds of work. High school shop class programs were widely dismantled in the 1990s to make room for computer classes. We had this idea then that somehow we're going to be taking leave of material reality and sort of gliding around in a pure information economy. But I think some people, and this is important, some people who are plenty smart would rather be learning to build things or fix things. And why not honor that? Consider a lineman restoring power during a storm. When we see that, I think we all feel gratitude. But I wonder if there's something else sort of under that gratitude, another feeling, something more like envy. Here's somebody doing something serious, something that it's possible to take seriously. And how many of us can say that? It's also hard work. It's physically hard. I started working as an electrician's helper when I was 14 and did it all through high school and college in the summers. And I graduated in 1989 with a degree in physics and moved to LA to look for work in aerospace. And I sent out dozens of resumes and got essentially zero response. So after several months, my savings were gone, and I found myself going around the parking lot of a home improvement store, putting flyers on the windshields of cars to advertise my services as an electrician. So the flyers said, "Unlicensed but careful." And it generated immediate response. There was more demand for my services as an unlicensed electrician than as a credentialed college graduate. So I went into business for myself doing that. And during that time, I never stopped taking pleasure in this moment that would come at the end of the job, where I would flip the switch and the lights would come on. In fact, I had this thing. I never got tired of, I say, "and there was light." So it was an experience of agency and competence. And the effects of my work were visible, just literally visible, for all to see. So my competence had a kind of social reality to it. I was sometimes kind of brought up short and made real quiet by a sight like this. So this is a big gang of conduits entering a panel. This is at a hospital in Detroit. Look in particular at the bends in the upper right-hand corner that come around and down and up and over. So this was a skill so far beyond my abilities that I felt that I was in the presence of some genius, and that whoever bent this conduit probably imagined this moment of recognition as he worked, that someone would recognize it for what it is, which is, I think, a work of art. And by the way, the name of the guy who bent this conduit is Denny Kaye, and there he is with his pipe bender. Most of my work, so I was doing residential and light commercial work, and so most of my work got covered up inside of walls. But still, I felt pride in meeting what are really the aesthetic demands of a workmanlike installation, because maybe sometime, the wall would get opened up and another electrician would see it someday, and I didn't want to be embarrassed by it. It's been said that craftsmanship consists simply in the desire to do something well for its own sake. And you recognize your own product in a world that's actually been transformed by your work. I think some people get hustled off to college and then to the cubicle against their own inclinations and natural bents. There's a pervasive anxiety among parents that there's only one track to success for their children, and it runs through a series of gates controlled by prestigious institutions. And of course, there's wide use of psychiatric drugs to medicate boys, in particular, against their natural bent toward action, the better to keep things on track, as the school nurse says. And this serves the interests of educators in preserving their own sanity. And I know that because I taught high school for a year, and I would have loved to have had a Ritalin fogger in my classroom, just for the sake of maintaining order. So I get it. But what I get, I think, is that it's a rare person, male or female, who's naturally inclined to sit still for 16 years at school and then indefinitely at work. And yet this has become the one-size-fits-all norm in education, even as we go on about diversity in education. We don't do a very good job of accommodating the diversity of dispositions. I think there's a lot of kids sitting in school studying for standardized tests and feeling like it isn't quite worthy of their full attention. They're sitting there feeling like it's bullshit. And you can't really blame them. Interestingly, things are quite different in Germany, for example, where a smart and aspiring young person might imagine himself becoming a prototype machinist at Mercedes-Benz, let's say. And that's a respectable aspiration to have. And in fact, it's about 50% of 16-year-olds enter apprenticeship programs there. And I'm going to come back to this idea of apprenticeship later. I stuck it out in college, high school and college. There was a period where I was getting an F in calculus, and the only thing that kept me coming to school every day was machine shop. It was the class that was the most intellectually engaging for me as a 17-year-old. I think there's probably a lot of people who feel that way. It was the class that sparked my love of learning. I got a PhD and landed a job at a think tank. So some jobs look really good on paper. And I loved graduate school, so what could be better than a think tank? Well, I'd say within about a week, it became clear that what this job would actually require was reasoning backwards from some desired conclusion to a suitable premise. It was a policy place, and like any such place, it had taken certain positions. And that meant that there were some facts that we were more fond of, let's say, than other facts. So I found myself making arguments that I didn't fully buy myself and putting my sort of credibility and honor in the service of things I couldn't really stand behind. And to make matters worse, my boss seemed intent on retraining me according to a certain cognitive style, let's say. And it was that of the corporate lobbying world, which he had recently come from. This style demanded that I project an image of rationality. That was very important. But not indulge too much in actual reasoning, because it could sort of lead off in the wrong direction. I lasted 5 months, I quit, and I opened a motorcycle repair shop. And the point of contrast I want to make is that in fixing motorcycles, you answer to standards that really aren't open to manipulation. Either the bike starts and runs right, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, there's no weaseling your way out of the fact. And I like that about it. The work is often frustrating, but it's never irrational. You might say the BS quotient is low. Unless you're dealing with Harley owners. And then it can actually be quite high. And I think people don't often appreciate how intellectually demanding that kind of work can be, diagnostic or mechanical work. We've developed, because the work is dirty, it's easy to assume that it's kind of stupid. And we have this dichotomy of knowledge work versus manual work. But that's a distinction that it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, say you're trying to diagnose why a car or a bike doesn't idle properly. It's not a trivial problem. And more generally, I'd say that the kind of thinking that goes on in the various trades can be genuinely impressive, but only if we stop to notice it. So here's one that's not going to idle anytime soon. This is you're looking at a pile of shrapnel, basically, at the bottom of this is a Ducati bevel drive motor from the 70s. But there it is put back together. So everything was okay in the end. I want to sort of leave you with the thought of apprenticeship again, because it's I think neither our economy nor our educational system really has much space or sort of regard for the idea of apprenticeship. And it's often said that that kind of training is too narrow and inflexible. And what the economy demands is workers who are flexible and not burdened by any particular set of skills. But I think it bears just thinking about that when you go deep into some particular art or skill, it trains your powers of concentration and perception. You become more discerning about the objects of this particular art and begin to care viscerally about excellence in this one domain. Usually, I think, because you've been initiated into an ethic of caring about what you're doing, often by the example of some mentor who embodies that spirit of craftsmanship. And I have to think that that can carry over into other pursuits that you might take up. So I want to suggest that technical training, though narrow in its immediate application, might be understood as part of education in the broadest sense. That is, intellectual and moral formation. Thank you.